Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here. If you are someone who is seeking to build your strength and endurance simultaneously, this video is going to cover 6 tips that should hopefully make combining them a little bit easier. I should note that these 6 tips are not necessarily the fundamentals of strength training, endurance training, or combining them. Things like exercise selection, volume, intensity, frequency, stuff like that. However, combining strength and endurance can sometimes feel like fitting a square in a round peg, especially when you take into account things like work, family, life, etc. Sometimes it takes a tip or a trick like the 6 I'm going to list in this video to make things feel a bit more smooth across the week. There are a few references I'm going to use to support some of the claims I make in this video. Those, if you want to check them out, can be found linked next to the claims that seek to support in the accompanying article, links down below. But then a lot of this stuff is going to come from my own experience working with clients and with myself, truthfully. So the source for a lot of where these tips come from is the intersection of those sort of things. So with that said, let's get right into the first one, which is to allocate your calf strength training volume to after your runs. And this can be after other forms of conditioning, like if you're doing bike, rowing, stuff like that. But runs, I think, it makes the most sense with. And the idea here is really to consolidate the stress imposed on your calves into fewer sessions across the week, ideally 2 or 3, as opposed to, probably every day or something like that if you don't have this sort of structure. So if you think about running, obviously every leg in your or every muscle in your leg rather is going to be highly active. I mean, even upper body is highly active as a counterweight in good running form, but your calves are arguably the most active and take the brunt of the load. And this is partially evidenced by the fact that the most common site of overuse injury from running is either at the Achilles tendon or the calf musculature itself. So when you do most of your calf strength training or all of your calf strength training after a run, as opposed to in your lifts or your leg days per se, oftentimes the result is that your calves get trained 2 to 3 times per week, as opposed to 4 or 5 or 6 times per week, depending on what your program looks like overall, which tends to make, in my experience, most people feel a bit better from a recovery standpoint, across the week. And it also, I think, makes a lot of sense from a time management perspective. So for instance, let's say you finish up a 30-minute tempo run and you go right into a couple sets of calf raises and tib raises. Ideally, maybe you find a step or something like that. So you have a large range of motion. You probably don't need to warm up, your sets of calf raises because you just went on a 30-minute tempo run, and it would take you less than a few minutes to knock them both out if you do it right away and you just go back and forth. And, in my opinion, anecdotally, I'm going to say, the calves do seem to be somewhat unique in that they can handle a high amount of volume within a session. I mean, they kind of need to, for where they're located on the body, at least. This would then free up some time in your lifts where you can focus on other accessories that might be a bit more pertinent to your strength goals. And again, as I say here, this may not be optimal per se in regard to developing your calves, but I do think it's going to give you probably 80-ish% of the results you need from a performance, aesthetics, injury risk reduction type of perspective. It's going to leave you with a bit more time in your strength training to focus on other things and should just make you feel better across the week overall. The second tip is going to be to add a brief bout of anaerobic conditioning after you finish a lift. And again, as I say here, I do have an article that details in more detail what the differences between aerobic and anaerobic conditioning is. But the only part that's really relevant for our purposes right now is that anaerobic entails brief and very high intensity bouts of effort, and aerobic entails longer, lower intensity bouts of effort, which is more of your traditional cardio per se. So functionally, an anaerobic run would be running as fast and as far as you can in the span of 2 or 3 minutes, whereas an aerobic run would be running for 45 minutes at a slow, easier intensity. And I've talked about this in other articles and videos and things to the like, but typically you don't want to combine your strength training and your aerobic training or your cardio into the same session. The main systematic review and meta-analysis that shows that lifting and cardio don't interfere with each other show that is the case primarily when they aren't combined into the same session. But then it also just doesn't really make sense from a time management perspective, because lifting, you're already looking at 30 to 60-ish minutes usually. And aerobic training, to really get the most out of it, you're probably going to need at least another 30 to 60 minutes. So combining those two specific types of training can make for a very long singular session. In regard to how your body has to produce the energy to fuel the activity, anaerobic training is more similar to lifting, far more similar to lifting is than aerobic training is. So it theoretically makes sense. I say theoretically because from a mechanistic perspective, it makes sense, but it's not something that has been tested per se, and I have outcome data I can present to validate this. But theoretically, it makes more sense to combine anaerobic conditioning and lifting than it does to make aerobic conditioning and lifting. And it certainly makes more sense from a time management perspective, as I said before. So here's an example of what this might look like. Let's say you are running 3 full body lifts per week as your strength training regimen. And let's say on one of those days, let's say the first day of the week, let's say you normally do 6 lifts per session. On one of those days, let's say the first one, you could do 5 lifts. And instead of a 6th lift per se, you could get on a rower and do 2 sets of 1 to 2 minutes at maximum effort with your same amount of rest that you would rest for, a set of squats or something like that. This is something I think is helpful for a few reasons. So first and foremost, if you want to maximally develop your conditioning capacity and your overall endurance, whatever your specific endurance goals may be, you need some type of anaerobic conditioning and some type of aerobic conditioning across the week. With aerobic specific training, you can be a bit more liberal with how you program it because it's much easier to recover from for your body. So for instance, you could do a 30-minute easy run the day before or after, or the morning or evening of the same day as a leg day, strength day per se. Anaerobic conditioning is a little trickier to program because it has very similar recovery demands as lifting will. An example would be a true high intensity interval run on a treadmill. Let's say you did 2 minutes at an easy intensity, 2 minutes at a max effort intensity, and you went back and forth 3 to 5 times. That's going to realistically require 48-ish hours before you do another intense training session on your legs. That could be intense running or it could be lifting. And if we go back to that same example of if you're following 3 full body lifts per week as the strength training portion of your program, adding in a true high intensity threshold type of training from a conditioning perspective, at least, can be a kind of hard piece of the puzzle to fit in there. So it kind of just flows a bit better, in my opinion, when you sneak it in there with a little bit of your lifting. And again, this is one of those things that it may not be optimal for the full development of your anaerobic conditioning, but I do think it is going to give you the vast majority of the benefits and save you a lot of time and a lot of sort of scheduling and programming headache across the week. So I'll admit this one is a little bit more out there compared to the other tips that are going to be in this video, but I don't think it is worth writing off, and I think it can be helpful under the right circumstance. So exercise snacks are something that was originally developed for the purpose of combating sedentary behavior. So a lot of the earliest studies took people who were sedentary, had them do like 1 set of sprints up a flight of stairs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and saw meaningful improvements in their health and their fitness across multiple different biomarkers that they tested. It is my opinion that a similar concept can be applied to your aerobic endurance training across the week. So this rests upon the idea that it does not really matter how you split up your total weekly endurance training volume across a week. So let's say you are planning to run 120 minutes at an easy intensity across the entire week. It's not going to make much difference if you do that in 2 60-minute sessions versus if you do it in 4 30-minute sessions. And as far as I am aware, there is no minimum amount to do in a single session that makes it not count per se. So let's say there's a point in the week where you don't have time to do a full 45, 60-minute session of some sort, but you do have 10, 15, or 20 minutes. And let's say, for example, that there are a couple different points in the week that are like that. If you do the math, this can easily add up to a whole extra session or two done across the week and really make a big difference in the results you see long term. This tip also lends to the idea that endurance, a lot of the gains you make in endurance at least, are going to be a function of volume, in the sense that doing more over time is going to be one of the biggest drivers of the results you see. But it also lends to the idea that something is always better than nothing. And even if you only have 10 minutes you can dedicate toward exercise as a point in the week, doing 10 minutes is, in my opinion, always better than doing 0 minutes. As I say here, this tip, I think, gives you more peace of mind than any sort of functional benefit to your programming across the week. And specifically, it's worth understanding that it takes probably a lot less work on both the strength and endurance side if things are structured well to see results over time. In other words, a lot of people end up feeling like they have to train all the time if they want to make gains in their strength and endurance throughout the course of time. And that really just is not the case. So for strength training, the minimum effective dose is what MED here stands for, is something like 3 to 4 sets per muscle group per week. And so, for instance, if you did 2 sets of chest on a Monday and you did 2 sets of chest on a Thursday, for most people, almost everyone, I feel comfortable saying at least, that is going to be enough to see gains in your chest size and strength over time. If you extrapolate that out to really all the major muscle groups in the body, that can be done in 2 full body workouts per week. Endurance, it's harder to say. With strength, it's a bit easier to sort of measure because you can break it down into an individual unit, which is, a set. But I've had clients do 90 minutes of structured endurance training in a week and, see meaningful results in that over time. And it's worth noting that the minimum physical activity guidelines, no matter where you look, if it's the ACSM, the CDC, whatever, are set at 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week. So what I'm telling you is you can make meaningful progress with less than what the minimum physical activity guidelines are. Again, as I say, it really helps if there's some structure and some thought that goes into this. But the thing that I really want to point out here is that these are both very manageable amounts of exercise to do across the week. Now, I don't think you necessarily need to stay at the minimum effective dose. I think you should increase it. I mean, you can if you want. Like I said, it's the minimum effective dose, meaning that it is effective. But you should scale both up really to your goals, your preferences, your availability, and whatever amount you end up at for each, you can rest assured that you are doing enough of each to see results over time. This is probably going to be one of the more helpful tips, honestly, across this entire video, and that is to use longer training blocks, or in other words, don't program hop and stay the course with what you're doing. So first and foremost, a training block or a mesocycle in more fancier periodization terms is a period of time in which your weekly structure or the workout you do in a week stays the same. So let's say your Monday session is the same, your Wednesday session, your Tuesday session, all that is the same. And ideally, there are set progressions that are made week to week within that structure. One of the main reasons this is important is that one of the primary drivers of undue soreness and needless recovery demand being increased is novelty. So if you're doing different workouts every week, every session, whatever, you're probably always going to feel more sore or sore, probably sore. I don't know with that one, honestly. Sore than you need to, all the time. If you keep a similar structure for a longer period of time, what ends up happening is you can train harder, recover better, and it makes it easier to force those progressions and make those progressions that are sort of preset into the training block. And I said before that this video wasn't going to cover the fundamentals of running a program, but honestly, I would consider this kind of a fundamental, and really just the idea that you have some sort of long-term thinking or programming to your training is kind of the fundamental here that I'm referring to. And I'm adding a tip 5.1 here, and that is to start the first week of a new training block at a sort of deload intensity, which means a decreased volume and a decreased intensity. So for example's sake, let's say in all of your lifts across a week, you intend to do 4 sets taken to near failure. In this first week, you could do 2 sets taken to 5 to 6 reps shy of failure. The idea here is that this can sort of fast track the familiarizing of this new training block to your body. And by that second week, you can train much harder and recover much better than if you hadn't done this sort of first deload week. And if you're someone who just likes to program regular deload weeks, over the course of time, I think this makes a sort of convenient way to use them, and gives them a bit more utility than just to deload flat out. And again, as I say here, you should view this as an investment for the weeks to come. So let's say you're following a 5-week training block, and you take that first one at a deload intensity. Those second 4 weeks, the last 4 weeks of that training block, are going to be of a much higher quality than if you had not done so in the first week. And the last tip of this video, and this is something I've talked about in other articles and videos and things of this sort, is to use a full body training split or a upper body, lower body training split for your strength training. So again, this rests on the idea, and this is a bit better supported than what I said for endurance, but in regard to strength training, the exact split you use does not matter so much if your total weekly volume is the same. And so in other words, if you are going to do 10 sets of chest per week as your total weekly training volume for your chest, it does not matter if you do that in 1, 2, or 3 different sessions across the week. So that lends the idea that no split is more or less advanced than another. A full body split is not any more advanced or less advanced than a bro split or push-pull legs or anything like that. And just briefly, if you're not familiar, a bro split is kind of the more historically known one, and that's where you have a chest day, a back day, a leg day, where all your body parts are sort of divided up into their own day. A push-pull legs split is where you do the pushing muscles of the body in one session, so chest, shoulder, triceps primarily. A pull is going to be primarily all the muscles of your back and your biceps, and then legs is legs. Now, if you're following a true program and a true training block, and let's say life happens and you're following a bro split and you miss the chest day of the week, you right then and there lose all of your chest volume that you had planned for the week in one fell swoop. That is not the case when you train your chest or you divide your chest training volume into 2 or 3 times per week, and where if you miss one session, it's fine because you have enough volume elsewhere in the week to still make meaningful progress in that week. Push-pull legs also solves that problem, but you need 6 days of lifting in order to hit every muscle twice per week and have that sort of insurance set in. That can make sense if you are only lifting and that's your only goal with training, but it leaves very little room for any structured endurance training of any kind. Both upper body and lower body training splits, as well as full body training splits, are going to allow you sufficient volume, more than sufficient volume, to see meaningful progress, in your strength and your muscle size across the week. They're going to give you insurance of training each muscle 2 times per week and leave plenty of volume or time in the week left to dedicate toward endurance training or whatever other training goal you have. I think full body can be particularly helpful because there's a lot of exercises themselves that are full body in nature. If you think of a normal deadlift, that's really a full body movement, not just a hamstring and glute exercise. Your back is being stimulated substantially. I think the same thing can be said about front squats, hanging leg raises, and everything else of the sort. So I think full body can offer you the widest variety of exercise selection. But again, I use upper body and lower body, or upper body, lower body, and full body splits quite regularly in all of my clients' programming. I personally see these as the only appropriate means of structuring your lifting if you are also pursuing endurance training. And with that said, that is the last tip that I have planned for this video. So I hope you found that somewhat helpful, interesting, or somewhere between. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, anything like that, just comment below and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And I will see you next time. Have a good one.